often goes unchallenged. The CCP has made unlawful claims to expand China's territorial waters, leveraging gray zones tactics, such as sending Chinese maritime militias, fishing vessels, and Coast Guard ships into contested waters to bully and coerce other nations. No country is more familiar with this tactic than the Philippines, where resupply missions to the Second Thomas Shoal are met with water cannons and ramming from CCP Coast Guard ships. Earlier this year, several American and international journalists witnessed the CCP's hostile tactics up close during an incident at sea that resulted in the injuries to Philippine Coast Guard personnel and damage to Philippine vessels. The CCP has exploited the U.S. and other nations' exclusive economic zones, or EEZs, through illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing that is threatening local economies and populations who depend on the fish as a food source. The CCP's distance water fishing fleet pillage fish stocks around the world, including U.S. territories like American Samoa. The maritime domain is complex, and the U.S. possesses the second largest exclusive economic zone in the world. The U.S. EEZ contains and facilitates enormous wealth, from offshore energy reserves such as oil and natural gas to mineral deposits and fish stocks. The Department of Homeland Security must reposition itself to combat this threat and allocate resources to the components best positioned to protect U.S. sovereignty. Throughout the 118th Congress, this subcommittee has examined a multitude of DHS mission sets and operational capabilities. Last month, we examined the department's and the Coast Guard's efforts to procure new cutters and how some of their key programs have fallen dangerously behind. In February, we examined port security, specifically the threat posed by Chinese manufactured cranes, a vulnerability the Coast Guard is working to mitigate. Additionally, our committee has examined threats in the Arctic and the Indo-Pacific. Each of these hearings feature a common thread: the CCP waging a gray zone conflict against U.S. maritime domain. The CCP poses the most significant challenge to the United States, our way of life, and the freedoms that we enjoy. We must work together in Congress to protect the homeland and ensure that the agencies we oversee are prepared and equipped to defeat the many threats that we face. I am grateful that we are joined by a distinguished panel of witnesses who are prepared to provide critical insights to this subcommittee. Mr. Sadler, Mr. Cooper, and Mr. Sharman, thank you for appearing before us this afternoon on this important topic, and I look forward to your testimony. I now recognize the ranking member, the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Thanadar, for his opening statement.
Good afternoon, and thank you, Chairman Jimenez, for calling today's hearing, and thank you to our witnesses for sharing their expertise with us today. People's Republic of China has grown increasingly aggressive within the maritime domain. The PRC has made many illegitimate territorial claims and has directed its naval forces to defend waters that are not China's waters to defend. The PRC's actions have threatened the free flow of travel and commerce throughout the Indo-Pacific, increasing tensions in an irresponsible manner. Most recently, the PRC issued rules allowing China's Coast Guard to detain foreigners who cross into waters China illegitimately claims as its own. These rules, if acted upon, have the potential to significantly increase tension in the region, which are already high. In addition, many Chinese fishing vessels continue to participate in illegal, unreported, and unregulated, or IUU, fishing. Huge populations are reliant on the stocks of fish in the Indo-Pacific region. IUU fishing threatens to damage the ecosystem and deplete those stocks, threatening the livelihood of those populations. Taken together, The PRC's actions in the maritime domain undermine the rules-based order the global maritime community relies on to maintain safety, security, and sovereignty at sea. The United States and its partners face tremendous challenges in responding to PRC's activities, especially in a way that seeks to ease tensions rather than further inflame them. China is a key U.S. trading partner, and according to the United Nations, 1/3 of global shipping passes through the South China Sea. The United States must be strategic in its efforts to counter the PRC's aggression and not simply build towards conflict. The U.S. Coast Guard is key to such strategic efforts. The Coast Guard is uniquely able to help counter the PRC's gray zone tactics in collaboration with international allies and partners. The Coast Guard's multifaceted missions allow the service to partner with countries in the region on a range of operations, from search and rescue to disaster relief to fisheries enforcement, all of which help to improve diplomacy. Congress must ensure the Coast Guard has the necessary resources to maintain a steady presence in the Indo-Pacific and help counter PRC aggression. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses how this committee can be helpful in advancing those efforts. Thank you again to all of our witnesses, and thank you, Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Ranking Member Thanedar. Other members of the committee are reminded that opening statements may be submitted for the record. Again, I am pleased to have a distinguished panel of witnesses before us today on this critical topic. I ask that our witnesses please rise and raise their right hands. Do you solemnly swear that the testimony you will give before the Committee on Homeland Security of the United States House of Representatives will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Let the record reflect that the witnesses have answered in the affirmative. Thank you, and please be seated. I would now like to formally introduce our witnesses. Captain Brent Sadler is retired U.S. Navy captain who currently serves as a senior research fellow at the Heritage Foundation. Captain Eric Cooper is retired U.S. Coast Guard captain who currently serves as a senior policy researcher at the RAND Corporation. Mr. Christopher Sharman serves as director for China Maritime Studies Institute at the U.S. Naval War College. I thank each of our distinguished witnesses for being here today. I now recognize Captain Sadler for 5 minutes to summarize his opening statements.
Thank you again for the opportunity to be with you today. And thank you, Chairman Jimenez and Ranking Member Shri Thanedar. The chance to speak specifically to your committee on a topic of very important national interest. China poses several threats to our nation's maritime sovereignty, most notably in the Pacific. The most insidious threats are termed gray zone because China's acts weaken the U.S. while avoiding an effective response. Unchecked, these acts weaken confidence in the U.S. and alienate our nation from allies. Should these gray zone acts escalate, it further exposes a Coast Guard of limited wartime utility expected to support a too small Navy. My comments this afternoon are born from 3 maritime threats germane to our discussion today. Number 1, predatory Chinese distant water fishing fleets. Number 2, Chinese fentanyl precursor trade with narcotics cartels. And number 3, the unchecked Chinese gray zone operations and their potential for escalation. Weakness in responding to these threats are exposing several vulnerabilities that invite future provocations that include, number 1, limited options to respond to Chinese maritime gray zone threats or tactics. These include shouldering, that is the pushing of one ship by another, and as mentioned already, the well-known water cannoning of Philippine vessels in the South China Sea. Failing to control the gray zone better will see U.S. maritime rights ceded to China or escalation unless more non-lethal options are provided our cutter and warship captains. Should conflict come, the Coast Guard would be expected to support naval operations, but the Navy and Coast Guard have devoted little time to training together. Moreover, today's Coast Guard cutters are not designed for naval warfare, nor readily able to be up-armed to support, for example, escort missions that would involve anti-submarine warfare. Second, the lack of presence in what is today's new great game for the South and Central Pacific. In an arc stretching over 1,400 miles from Wake Island to Johnson Atoll and south 1,900 miles to American Samoa are 6 U.S. exclusive economic zones, rich in fish and untapped natural resources. Too few cutters with inadequate range for Pacific operations are providing a vacuum for Chinese distant water fishing fleets, as well as nefarious influence campaigns. The movement of medium-endurance cutter Harriet Lane in January to Hawaii is good, but is not enough. Recent poor recruiting and cratering retention is seeing too many cutters being idled, like medium-endurance cutter Dependable sidelined in March and more likely to follow. Third, limited maritime counter-narcotics capacity is allowing Chinese criminal elements in league with narcotics cartels a vehicle to harm Americans. Consider that in 2022, the Coast Guard removed over 212,000 pounds of cocaine, 54,000 pounds of marijuana, worth a wholesale value of $2.9 billion US. A lot for sure, but for the cartels and increasingly Chinese criminal syndicates, amounts little more than accounting error in a trade that is worth, or estimated to be worth, well over $652 billion. Securing Americans from the scourge of illegal drugs will mean putting the cartels out of business by more fully utilizing the proven successes of organizations such as Joint Interagency Task Force South and better leveraging their partners. This could begin with reactivating Navy's 2 expeditionary transfer dock ships with more than 10 years of life left. 4, and lastly, when a port is closed due to a natural disaster, or as we saw in Baltimore this March, an elision by today's massive ships, there is too little capacity to reopen these ports. In peacetime, this is inconvenient and economically crippling at best, and during wartime, unacceptable. More is needed to ensure prompt reopening of strategically important ports in our nation, such as increased salvage capacity, heavier lift floating cranes, and firefighting boats, to name a few. In closing, our ports are our lifeblood for trade and vital in sustaining wartime operations. In our nation's expansive and rich Pacific waters are billions of dollars of minerals and fish stocks, all vulnerable to poaching. And today on our streets are narcotics enabled by cartels fed the chemicals to make possible a fentanyl epidemic, killing now over 70,000 Americans yearly. A response to these threats is needed and starts at sea with a stronger Coast Guard and an invigorated maritime sector at home. Thank you very much and look forward to the questions.
Thank you, Captain Sadler. I now recognize Captain Cooper for 5 minutes to summarize his opening statement.
Chairman Jimenez, Ranking Member Tanadar, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify before you today. I am a senior policy researcher at RAND, a nonprofit and nonpartisan organization. Prior to joining RAND, I served in the Coast Guard for 30 years in multiple roles, to include the Director for Maritime Security for the National Security Council, Commanding Officer of Maritime Security Response Team West, Deputy Director of Operations at Coast Guard Pacific Area, and aboard Coast Guard cutters conducting UN Security Council sanction enforcement, fisheries enforcement, security cooperation, and joint operations with partner nations. The opinions and recommendations in this testimony build on my own research and experience in the Coast Guard and center around a perspective editorial I wrote while at RAND. In this testimony, I focus on developing an international partnership of like-minded nations that can create a concerted effort to establish rule of law in the Indo-Pacific, in what has become an ungoverned and sometimes misgoverned space. The concept is built around the use of a consolidated force of Coast Guards and law enforcement agencies to combat the use of gray zone tactics by the Chinese. Not everyone may be familiar with the term or tactics of gray zone activities, and not everyone may agree on all aspects of it. So to clarify, when I use the term, it is based around activities that occur in an operational space, where an entity is trying to challenge the status quo, coerce other nations, or obfuscate legal definitions by being provocative above what is considered normal nation-state activities, but below what is considered the threshold for a military response. A typical example in the Indo-Pacific, as has been mentioned, is how China is attempting to rewrite the law of the Sea Convention through its 9-dash line enforcement. They use the ambiguity of their people's armed forces maritime militia to harass and coerce other vessels by ramming other fishing vessels in these contested areas. The Chinese Coast Guard has used the water cannons and threats of force to expel other sailors from rightful fishing grounds or territory. One of the reasons that this occurs, in my opinion, is that it goes unchecked and unchallenged. Even when other nations push back, China has more power, both economically and militarily, to escalate the situation and use the fog of the gray zone tactics to claim self-defense or use misinformation to confuse the actual scenario. I offer that one way to close the gray zone gap is to reduce ambiguity by better defining the rule of law and reinforcing the same through a coalition of partners. Defining the law is one step, but it only works if there's enforcement, and to do that, you need presence. The way that I propose doing this is through the development of a combined maritime force comprised of Coast Guards and law enforcement agencies of Indo-Pacific nations. The reason I focus on a combined maritime force is that it's a known entity, and we've used joint and combined agencies in the maritime domain extensively throughout time. Currently, the combined maritime force that is based in Bahrain has 5 task forces that focus on different aspects in the region. Nations in the Indo-Pacific would likely be interested in joining this kind of group if properly built. Primarily, it will provide an opportunity to build partnerships, push back against the hegemony of China, and focus on other key issues. I offer as a start that there are 3 areas for the CMF to focus on: information and maritime domain awareness, training and capacity building, and illegal and unregulated and unreported IUU fishing enforcement. Maritime domain awareness is critical because without this first step, it's going to be very difficult to perform operational activities in such a vast region. Leveraging the already established Indo-Pacific Partnership for Maritime Domain Awareness to work under the coordination of the CMF would contribute to achieving this goal. The second step is the development of a task force that focuses on cooperative and coordinated training. Again, this is something that is needed to help with the next steps of building an operational task force, since the Indo-Pacific is massive, and you want to empower and enable nations to do this without U.S. presence. Focusing the first operational task force on IUU fishing is important because it is a key concern not only for all of the nations in the region, but globally. Moreover, most nations in the region will agree to this effort because it protects their resources, it builds operational skills, it enhances cooperative partnerships, it pushes back against China's illegal fishing activity, and it's supported by international law and agreement. It also addresses the issues of sovereignty, which is what gray zone tactics are exploiting. Finally, my recommendation is to have the U.S. Coast Guard lead this for several reasons. The U.S. Coast Guard is a respected entity that already operates in the region. It is less escalatory than the Navy. The Coast Guard authorities and partnerships already exist, and the Coast Guard is already doing training and law enforcement in the region. It provides an opportunity for the U.S. to lead without conflating the Navy's role in current mission. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify today.
Thank you, Captain Cooper. I now recognize Mr. Sharman for 5 minutes to summarize his opening statement.
Chairman Jimenez, Ranking Member Tenedar, distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for having me here today. It's truly an honor. It's especially poignant that I'm here today, of all days, the 35th anniversary of China's brutal crackdown on human rights in Tiananmen Square. Today, it's appropriate that we're talking about China gray zone operations as an extension of what we saw 35 years ago. I'm here to tell you today that Beijing is waging what some PRC sources refer to as a war without gunsmoke in the gray zone of maritime East Asia. China's Coast Guard and maritime militia are on the front lines of its seaward expansion, asserting China's maritime claims through non-lethal means, operating in the gray zone that falls below the threshold of war. They are supported in the distance by People's Liberation Army Navy, which compels foreign states to compete on China's terms. Together, China's 3 maritime forces enable the PRC to leverage its national power as part of a quest for China to win without fighting. China has the world's largest Coast Guard by number of ships and operates more maritime law enforcement vessels than the Coast Guards of all its regional neighbors combined. China's maritime militia possesses ships that resemble fishing trawlers but are ideally suited for gray zone operations. China's 3 sea forces are all part of China's armed forces. They operate under a chain of command that leads up through the PLA Central Military Commission and ultimately to China's paramount leader, Xi Jinping himself. As such, China's Coast Guard and maritime militia are state-sponsored, and one should not consider them to be civilian vessels. The PRC empowers its maritime forces with domestic laws that it imposes on international waters, the International Maritime Commons. China's 2021 Coast Guard law includes a provision that permits the Coast Guard to take all necessary measures, including the use of force, within the maritime areas under China's jurisdiction. Effective as of June 15th this year, China's Coast Guard will possess authority under PRC law to detain foreigners for up to 60 days without trial, namely those who are suspected of illegally crossing into PRC's claimed maritime boundaries. PRC gray zone operations directed at Taiwan are escalating rapidly. Back on February 14th, a speedboat from China's Fujian province capsized off the eastern coast of Taiwan's offshore island of Kinmen as it was being chased by the Taiwan Coast Guard, resulting in the deaths of 2 of the 4 people on board. The mainland vessel had crossed into Taiwan's claimed prohibited waters and refused to be subjected to Taiwan's Coast Guard inspections. In response to the incident, China's Taiwan Affairs Office took direct aim at Taiwan's sovereignty and ability to police its own waters by announcing that there was no such thing as prohibited or restricted waters. Several days later, the PRC followed up on its rhetoric with actions by employing its Coast Guard to board and inspect the Taiwan sightseeing ship Golden, which was operating in the vicinity of Kinmen. This was the first time that the PRC Coast Guard inspected a Taiwan sightseeing ship and diverged from the status quo that it held since the 1990s when Taipei established the concept of restricted waters. China Coast Guard ships then began to regularly patrol waters around Kinmen. PRC entered these waters 4 times in March, 4 times in April, and 8 times in May. As recently as last week, China turned up the rheostat one more time. China's 2 small Chinese Navy vessels entered these same waters, penetrated these same waters south of Kinmen. Although through these incursions, the PRC has used gray zone tactics to eviscerate Taiwan's sovereignty around its offshore islands and to pressure Taipei. PRC maritime coercion around Taiwan's offshore islands is part of a larger all-domain pressure campaign to undermine Taiwan's sovereignty and legitimacy. The PLA recently executed a pre-planned 2-day military drill following the inauguration of Taiwan's new president. A near record number of PRC Navy vessels operated around Taiwan, and it included an unprecedented integration of China Coast Guard operations both around Taiwan's offshore islands and also to the east of Taiwan, a potential harbinger of PRC law enforcement operations in the Western Pacific. Our allies can teach us valuable lessons about how to counter PRC gray zone tactics. Japan publicly disseminates information about each PRC incursion in the waters around the Senkaku Islands and releases photographs demonstrating that its Coast Guard remains on the landward side of China's Coast Guard vessels, thereby conveying administrative control. Japan's maritime presence and law enforcement response to China's incursions underscores Japan's legal claims while pushing back against PRC gray zone tactics. And the Philippines employs a similar transparency tactic, as you have seen. Manila's policy is to respond to PRC bad behavior with measured transparency by documenting and publicizing each incident. This name and shame approach has drawn the world's attention to the plight of Philippine vessels and has helped place the PRC on the defensive. In my written statement, I include a few recommendations as well. That's all. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Sharman. Members will be recognized by order of seniority for their 5 minutes of questioning. I now recognize myself for the 5 minutes of questioning. There's so much to talk about, and I don't know where to begin, but let's start with capability. About 6 months ago, 9 months ago, I actually was in the South China Sea and saw firsthand Chinese naval vessels and Chinese Coast Guard vessels. What struck me was that there's very little difference between the two. So Captain Sadler, can you tell me about what the difference is between a Chinese naval vessel and a Chinese Coast Guard vessel? Because they sure as heck look real similar to me.
Maybe the paint scheme, and it's no secret when they first started standing up a Chinese Coast Guard, they repurposed Navy frigates and older vessels. So they were, by all intents and purposes, other than the paint scheme, Navy vessels. And they remain larger than even Japanese Coast Guard, which is a very capable Coast Guard, and they certainly outclass in tonnage and the ability to carry weapon systems than any one of their neighbor countries in the South China Sea.
And so how do our Coast Guard vessels stack up against their Coast Guard vessels, or don't they stack up? They are the most largest, or the larger of the Chinese Coast Guard vessels are larger than our Coast Guard
vessels. The NSC might come comparable. I would defer to my fellow shipmates here that have been served in the Coast Guard, but the size of the Coast Guard ships that the Chinese are putting to sea are meant for distant sea operations, which really puts at risk, and we should be looking at where they plan to operate, from the Aleutian Islands to the Central Pacific, and as far away as the Gulf of Guinea, potentially.
Captain Cooper?
I would echo my colleagues' compartment's remarks here. The Chinese vessels are extremely large. They're incomparable to the Coast Guard vessels, particularly if you look at the fast response cutters, which we're looking out there, which we're placing out there, which are significantly smaller. But I would say the biggest component is the number of Chinese vessels out there. We're talking roughly 700 vessels that they have in the region, as opposed to the handful, the dozen that are out there by the U.S. Coast Guard when they're not performing other missions.
700 Coast Guard vessels or 700 in total vessels?
There's 700 Chinese Coast Guard vessels of varying sizes
In the region?
in the Indo-Pacific, yes.
How many Coast Guard vessels do we have in our region, let's say in the United States? That's their neighborhood, so how about us? What do we have running around here?
So currently we have 3 fast response cutters in Guam. We have 3 fast response cutters in Hawaii. There's 2 national security cutters in Hawaii and a buoy tender in Guam.
I'm talking about the United States, around the United States. So we can let's do apples to apples. Their Coast Guard, that Coast Guard that's next to China. Okay, that's their neighborhood. What about in our neighborhood? How many Coast Guard vessels do we have running around here?
Around the United States?
Yeah.
Oh, I don't know the exact numbers that we currently have around, but it's not 700, maybe.
Yeah, I happen to have those numbers in front of me. In Coast Guard, at their website, they have their overall fleet size is about 259. But if you really want to get at what the Coast Guard, our Coast Guard, has in its arsenal or its fleet to go into distant, deep blue water kind of patrols, you've got 8 national security cutters. You've got 2 high-endurance cutters. These are older vessels, 28 medium endurance. And then you got 41 fast response cutters, which are kind of, I would say in the Pacific, you're really pushing it. But that's the total.
Okay, one of you just said we need to better define laws. Okay, what laws? I think that was Captain Cooper. Is that you?
Yeah, yes, sir. So I think that the biggest issue is the gray zone itself encompasses those activities which may or may not be illegal. And the way China looks at it is what they're doing is enforcing what they believe is legal, but is in disagreement with what the rest of the international community agrees. So doing the gray zone tactics that they're performing in the Indo-Pacific is clearly in violation of the Law of the Sea Convention. And so by not establishing what our responses are makes it very challenging for the Coast Guard and for the Navy and for other nations to be able to respond, because we don't have a planned response and we haven't identified what that looks like.
Well, I would assume that they would say that this is totally legal because these are our waters, right? And so our disagreement is what are their waters and what are not their waters. Is that the disagreement?
That's correct. And so going back to my combined maritime force, I think that by building a coalition, we can build some international consensus over what those rules should look like and how to respond to them.
Well, okay, my time's up, so I'll probably have a second round coming around. So now I recognize the ranking member, Mr. Thanadar.
Thank you, Chairman Jimenez. And thank you all for testifying this afternoon. The threat that People's Republic of China possesses to the international maritime domain has evolved through the years. China's continued aggressive behavior and use of gray zone tactics towards Taiwan, the Philippines, and other countries in the region has led to periodic standoffs and clashes. Captain Sharman, what are some examples of model responses to the PRC's gray zone tactics in the Indo-Pacific?
Ranking Member Tendar, thank you for the question. The countries in the region have demonstrated different tactics in response to gray zone. The various tactics that they have demonstrated in various ways, there has been some success. There is some lessons that we perhaps can take from our partners in the region. Let me just run through a couple examples as I think about it. I mentioned in my written testimony that about Japan. I call Japan's tactics persistence. That is, they never cede anything. Japan's actions around the Senkaku Islands never cede to that the islands themselves are in dispute, which is what China's goal is. Japan's Coast Guard is always there. Vietnam uses a tactic called, I would call more brinksmanship. Back in 2014, the Chinese deployed an oil rig into disputed waters. Vietnam responded very aggressively and didn't fare well at sea, but this started causing problems in Vietnam. And the whole of nation pressure from Vietnam onto China caused China to back off of where they were. Philippines, we've seen their aggressive transparency. Malaysia, I call that partnership. Malaysia, back in 2020, the CTF-76 stood up, and they demonstrated, that was with Australia and the United States Navy, and they demonstrated a persistent presence in the area. And that was enough to push China back.
Thank you. How might the United States strengthen communication and coordination with its allies and partners to counter the PRC's tactics more effectively?
Thank you, sir. From a strategic perspective, our partners are looking to see if the U.S. is going to be there for them. So we need to demonstrate that we're going to be there now and in the future. The more confident they are in our support, the more willing they will be to push back on PRC coercive actions. So we build trust through exercises, education, and routine interaction. We can't just have this as a check in the box. We have to be there regularly. But a goal should be to develop shared awareness in the maritime domain. And the Secretary of Defense recently highlighted the Indo-Pacific Partnership for Maritime Domain, which enhances partnership and the ability for nations to police their own waters. So there is opportunities to build a common operational picture.
Thank you. And another question for Captain Cooper. You testified about the potential benefits of a combined maritime force that could be created by the U.S. and its partners in the region. What impact do you believe such a force would have on the PRC's ability to continue to threaten Taiwan's sovereignty?
Yeah, thank you for the question, Mr. Senator. The CMF, what that will do is create this coalition of like-minded nations. And so by training those nations in some of those tactics and increasing their capability and their capacity, I think what we'll have is an increased presence in the region. And presence can lead to deterrence in some cases. And so by having a force that is consolidated under one organization, of which the U.S. has influence, I think would be very beneficial in pushing back against some of China's
Thank you.
tactics.
And my last question, Captain Sharman, what are some of the actions the U.S. should consider taking immediately to counter the PRC's threat towards Taiwan? How about longer-term solutions that should be considered?
Okay, real quickly, regarding Taiwan, I think there's some near-term and some long-term options. From a near-term perspective, I think delivery of congressionally already approved munitions and equipment to Taiwan and making good on our promises would be an effective first step. The goal really should be for Xi Jinping to wake up every morning and say, today is not the day. The more powerful, the more that we can enhance Taiwan's capabilities, the more we can make that happen. We also should seek to expand Coast Guard cooperation. We have a good working relationship with the Taiwan Coast Guard, with a memo signed back in 2021. I think there's opportunities to expand that. Real quickly, from a longer-term perspective, I think we need to, echoing Secnav Del Toro, who called for revitalizing our maritime industry. I think there's an opportunity here for shipbuilding, coalition building, and maritime statecraft. I think he has it right.
Thank you so much, and my time is up. I yield back.
Thank you to the ranking member. I now recognize the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Higgins.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Captain Sharman, or do you prefer professor?
Sir, I've learned not to specify what I'm called here at today's committee. Mr. works great.
and a smart fella. So I'm going to refer to you as Captain. Captain, for the benefit of Americans watching today, would you just summarize briefly what exactly is gray zone coercion by China, specifically in the Indo-Pacific region?
Gray zone actions, there are many definitions of gray zone actions. Gray zone actions are actions below the threshold of war. It's a tactic that is used to achieve a strategic objective. In this case, the PRC is attempting to advance its strategic goals, so they use this tactic to execute operations that are not going to perhaps prompt a response by other countries in the region, United States, et cetera. So they keep those gray zone operations just ambiguous enough that there is plausible deniability.
Okay, I would concur. It's a pretty good assessment. And essentially, again, for Americans paying attention here, we certainly recognize, as a people, we recognize that the Communist Chinese leadership poses a potential threat to world peace, and particularly their threat to seize, essentially control and possession of Taiwan is an important ally for the United States and the free world. This is what regular Americans discuss when we talk about, what is the potential for war with China. So the gray zone coercion and their tactics to advance their own causes in that region while staying below the threshold of what would internationally be recognized as an act of war. They're still being very aggressive. They're using war cannons and water cannons rather, and quite aggressive maneuvers with their ships. Just recently, they conducted a very threatening naval blockade around Taiwan, and there was American presence there, which is normally the case in Taiwan. So I ask you, Captain, did you serve with Admiral Philip Davidson? You familiar with Admiral Davidson? Are you familiar with the Davidson window?
Yes, sir.
His anticipated potential manifestation of conflict, he called it, within 6 years. That was 2021. So we've reached the edge of that Davidson window here. How likely are we to face significant conflict with China, specifically regarding Taiwan in the coming year or two? You teach at the War College, right?
Yes, sir.
The Naval War College. You're a gentleman of distinguished accomplishment. I've read your bio, and thank you for your service. So just tell America, how likely are we to face conflict with China in the Pacific?
Congressman Higgins, thank you so much for your question, and it is a really good one. And I think putting timelines on is very dangerous, but because the PRC has put very specific dates that they are looking at. 2027 is a modernization goal to have capabilities that they need for Taiwan. 2035 is a modernization goal where they want to be fully modernized.
You're talking about China wants
China.
China has a 2027 goal.
China has a 2027 goal.
Okay,
Yes,
in my remaining 30 seconds, I'd like to interject an associated question here for you, because you also have training in language, Japanese, Chinese, and Vietnamese, my understanding is. I recall in the 80s, they used to advise us, don't pay attention to what Yasser Arafat was saying in English, pay attention to what he's saying in Arabic. And so I'm asking you, what is the president of China saying in Chinese about Taiwan?
He is directing his military to absolutely prepare him options for Taiwan. He is on a determined, we call this the decade of maximum danger, is what we call it in my office. Xi Jinping is not getting any younger, and he wants to resolve the Taiwan question and not pass it on to another generation. It's his birthday in 2 weeks. He turns 71. So the next decade is going to be particularly difficult as new capabilities continue to come online and their capacity increases overall.
Thank you, gentlemen. I have questions in writing. I'll submit to you each. Thank you for appearing here today, Mr. Chairman. I yield.
Mr. Higgins, I plan on having a second round, so if you have some additional questions, please stick around. I now recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Garcia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for being here today. Appreciate that. Our country obviously faces unprecedented challenges and threats on both the domestic and international stage. We were just discussing one of our major threats, of course, globally. We also know that climate catastrophes like the Maui fires, to repelling Russian expansion in the Arctic, to supporting our allies in the Indo-Pacific in the face of Chinese aggression. All of these are absolutely critical to the Coast Guard, to Coast Guard readiness, and to the ability for the Coast Guard to do its job. In a world that's becoming more and more dangerous, our partnerships and alliances keep us strong. Our Coast Guard's presence and operations across the globe are vital to maintaining those friendships. I was mayor of Long Beach, California prior to this. I think we've met some of you before, and obviously work with our Coast Guard very closely. We have one of America's largest ports, and so the work the Coast Guard does there is incredibly important. And the professionalism of the Coast Guard is incredible, so thank you. Obviously, this work is bipartisan. That's really important. We also know, then talking about China, that China is clearly a competitor and someone that our relationship is increasingly complicated. And we also need to recognize at the same time that China is our largest trading partner. It's America's #1 trading partner by far. And our economies are also linked together by trade, particularly coming in through our West Coast ports. We also want to make sure that the Coast Guard has an important relationship to play in that relationship. Mr. Cooper, I want to thank you for being here and your many years of service to the Coast Guard. Wanted to ask, we've recently seen escalations of China's behavior, both on the economic side and on the military side. These actions endanger the economies and livelihoods of the island nations and, of course, threaten our U.S. interests. What can the Coast Guard do, perhaps separately than DOD, that's different to DOD, that maybe DOD can't do, to further our U.S. interests in the region?
Thank you, sir. Appreciate the question. The Coast Guard obviously does a lot more than just security, right? They do the environmental response. They also have the ability to project defense operations. They do port, waterway, coastal security. They do aids to navigation. So working with the partners in the Indo-Pacific, their presence there allows them to not only provide training for security, but also search and rescue if needed, as well as environmental response or humanitarian assistance. So it's a multi-pronged capability that the Coast Guard brings to the table.
Thank you, and want to expand on some of the challenges, particularly with China. According to the Illegal and Reported Unregulated Fishing Index, China ranks as the worst offender of all 152 countries worldwide that are tracked. A recent strategic report from the U.S. Coast Guard assessed that illegal fishing has replaced piracy as a leading global maritime security threat. Clearly, we're destroying ocean ecosystems, crippling food chains, threatening sustainable fisheries. Of the 36 nations within the Indo-Pacific region, nearly all are maritime nations, with over 1/3 being smaller island nations. Mr. Cooper, can you walk us through the role that the Coast Guard is playing in supporting these nations and addressing the issue of China's illegal fishing?
Yes, thank you again for the question, Congressman. So the Coast Guard has been very innovative and leaning forward in some of their support to the Indo-Pacific nations, not only with the training. When I was active duty, we would train a lot of those forces on securing their own sovereignty, providing them the capabilities and the capacity to do that. So in addition, we work closely with the Navy through the Oceanic Maritime Security Initiative, which focuses on IUU fishing. They've put the additional fast response cutters in region, and then they also have the Indo-Pacific Support Tender, which is out there doing IUU fishing, and they've signed some pretty substantial shipwriter agreements with 12 of the countries, or 12 of the nations in the region, particularly allowing the Coast Guard to do boardings and enforce IUU fishing infractions in those nations' waters without a shipwriter present, which is a tremendous capability that they've provided to those countries.
Thank you. And we know, that China has a massive fishing fleet, much larger than any other nation in the world. Illegal behavior around fishing from the Chinese is very common. Our partners like Vietnam and Philippines in the Pacific and smaller island nations, of course, don't have anywhere near the resources or capabilities to secure their own waters. Now, I understand, and we've discussed this here at this subcommittee before, that the Coast Guard only has about 5 cutters that are currently operating in the Indo-Pacific region, which spans, of course, 40 million square miles. Mr. Sadler, can you give us some insight onto how an expanded fleet of cutters would actually enable the Coast Guard to both effectively enforce the maritime law, but also safety for mariners and coasties?
Absolutely, thank you. The question is how can you maintain the right presence at the right place in an immense Pacific Ocean? And it comes down to numbers. Coast Guard is long overdue in providing publicly what that force would require, fixed-wing aircraft at places like Canton Island and Kiribati. So you have to also have places as well as ships to do repairs, having repair facilities in, say, American Samoa, and then having those cutters out patrolling our EEZs firstly, and then working and playing, to use a football term, playing man, using collective intelligence gathering and following these dark fleets, and then vectoring in with our allies and partners in the region to watch and to ensure and regulate these largely unregulated distant fishing fleets, Chinese fishing fleets. And things like the Pacific Quad with France, New Zealand, and Australia, long-standing is a venue for doing that. And then also, as already mentioned by Captain Cooper, using shipwriters and actually having virtual call-in to the justice, the equivalent of the justice departments in these island nations to effect arrests and then to transfer those people to their own shoreside justice system. So there's a lot that we can do. There's little examples of it, but to really get it to the scale that's meaningful against the threat, we have to get more cutters into the theater.
Thank you, I appreciate that. And Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. Now I'm going to have a second round of questioning. And so, Mr. Sharman, do you agree with the statement that every dollar that an American spends on Chinese good will eventually be used for A, the Chinese Communist Party oppressing and suppressing its own people, and B, be used against counter to American interests?
Mr. Chairman, I think there's certainly a heck of a lot of repression that's going on in the PRC. I don't know if I would say every single dollar, but I will chalk it up to folks who say that, and there are folks who do a lot more research than I do on that part.
But would you agree that we could be funding our greatest strategic threat globally right now, that America is partially funding that threat?
There's no question that we have relationships with China and Chinese companies that are state-owned enterprises that are filtering money directly back to the Chinese Communist Party. There is no question that there is a challenge we face because our trade is so interconnected and intertwined, and it's difficult to disentangle ourselves. So I do agree, yes, sir, that there is some funding that is going back.
I may be more to the right on this and more hawkish on this, but I do believe that we need to start decoupling ourselves from the CCP because I believe we are funding the instruments of our demise, and we're also funding the instruments that it's suppressing the Chinese people today on the 35th anniversary of Tiananmen Square. I also believe that our policy of, done some 30, 35 years ago of trying to bring China into, the world of nations and the World Trade Organization will go down as one of the biggest miscalculations of policy in American history. And we're going to be paying for it. And so while it will be painful to decouple ourselves, we need to decouple. And we need to decouple yesterday. Because the only way that we may avoid a kinetic conflict is by weakening them economically, because that's the only way that they fund the PLA and all the other activities that they're doing. One question that I have for you again is, you said that this gray zone activity was part of a strategic plan by China. And frankly, I'm not understanding the strategic plan. I could understand them doing gray zone activities against Taiwan and probing that. I don't understand why they're also poking Japan and the Philippines and Vietnam and other people or nations in their region, because those folks are starting to wake up that, hey, we need to do something about this, and actually bringing them together, coalescing them against China. So what is the strategic vision or plan or outcome that China is looking with these gray zone activities?
So, Mr. Chairman, I think where China is going is in what they would refer to as the near seas, that being the Yellow Sea, the East China Sea, South China Sea. They want to make that essentially a law enforcement area. They want to demonstrate authority and the ability for their Coast Guard to be able to enforce their laws and basically subjugate the entire areas to Chinese law and their institutions and their way of how they look at the world. And that frees up then the Navy, the People's Liberation Army Navy, to expand, to go increasingly going global. And so from a strategic perspective, you have kind of a near seas, you have a far seas, and frankly, you have an Arctic that I think is coming down the road. So this is what is ahead. China seeks to have a world-class military by 2049. And that world-class, their concept of world-class is the gold standard, the United States military. They want to have some of the same capabilities to be able to go around the world and conduct operations around the world.
Now let's turn our attention. Okay. Yeah, I agree with that. Now, one final thing, and I want for Captain Sadler, maybe during my time, fentanyl. Fentanyl is killing 70, 80,000 Americans every single year. We know that the precursor chemicals are actually being manufactured in China. Not only are they being manufactured in China, they're being subsidized by the CCP. Even though those precursor chemicals are actually illegal to sell in China, they subsidize those companies so they can export this poison into the United States. How does that poison make its way into the United States? And I know it goes to the Mexican cartels, but how does it get to them?
So there's two main avenues. One is they come through the partial post system. You just come right into our ports of entry. And at LAX right now, there's stories that we're starting to find because we're actually inspecting more rigorously there. More needs to be shown on that. But at the other end of this, with the heavier, because there's a number of precursor chemicals, some of which wouldn't fit into a partial, or which you could easily cover up with false statements. So you need barrels of this stuff. That's coming in by ships, mostly, some by aircraft coming into, say, Mexico or other countries in the region, and then ferried up to the border and then manufactured on either the north or the south side of the border. It's wherever they can get away with it. It's constantly moving and changing. But you have to put the cartels out of business, and the way you hurt their bottom line and take away that vehicle for Chinese crimes and also the Chinese Communist Party to get that poison into the United States is you have to sever off the sea routes that the cartels rely on.
Thank you. My time is up. I now recognize the ranking member. Okay, I now recognize the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Higgins.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Captain Sadler, could you give us your assessment of how you feel about the Navy's current shipbuilding evolution with embracing emerging technologies of smaller, relatively less expensive, perhaps expendable autonomous vessels, and what role they should play in the Navy's future, including our engagements ongoing with China below the threshold of war, or should that threshold be crossed and we're in open conflict with China, what role would smaller, less expensive, expendable autonomous vessels play, and should the Navy embrace that emerging technology?
I will try to be as short as I possibly can and narrowly focused. First is an example of success, Task Force 59, the 5th Fleet in the Persian Gulf, where they used unmanned vessels very rapidly by using some very unconventional approaches in procurement and also partnering with other countries. That's in the process of being replicated in 4th Fleet, which is Southern Command, which is a lot of these illicit trade routes that I'm talking about, that's inside their area of responsibility. That needs to happen now, and it should be supported. And it's going to rely on small unmanned vessels as sensors, like sail drone, but also even aircraft drones as well. They need something to operate sustained way off out at sea, like a mothership. In the Pacific, now you've got Pacific Fleet that also stood up in the last couple of years, a development squadron of pairing a manned ship, the Zumwalt-class destroyer, with large and medium unmanned vessels. That has a very high-end operational, but again, if you don't have that upper level control, the Chinese are gonna be able to push that red line further and further north and get away with more and more. So you have to get those unmanned vessels out into the Pacific. You need to use them as sensors and also as a backstop, as a weapons platform, should things go higher.
I generally agree with your assessment. It's become very clear that the expense of large, traditional sort of 20th century envisioned massive vessels of war that are incredibly expensive to build and remarkably easy to sink, apparently, with small, inexpensive, expendable, properly armed, autonomous craft. This is a reality that we are hopeful that our Navy can embrace, and we think that it would be quite effective in pushing against the momentum that China has established with its shipbuilding, which is important to note, it greatly outpaces American shipbuilding. We believe that, I believe that we can build a force that is so overwhelmingly daunting to the vessels that China has constructed. We think we can further secure the world, including the Indo-Pacific region. Captain Cooper, same question, but for the Coast Guard. What role would smaller, less expensive, autonomous vessels play for the Coast Guard?
Yeah, thank you for the question, Congressman. So the Coast Guard has written an unmanned system strategy. In my opinion, it needs to be implemented much more quickly. If you look at the Indo-Pacific, similar to what Captain Sadler is saying, I think that there's a lot of potential to include unmanned systems to help with the maritime domain awareness specifically. Also, a lot of those partner nations are fairly weak in their maritime capability and don't have as much funding as the United States. And so these cheaper systems would be useful in allowing those countries to actually use them for maritime domain awareness and to be able to control their own sovereign waters.
Thank you, gentlemen. Mr. Chairman, those are my additional questions. I yield.
Thank you, and I thank the witnesses for their valuable testimony and the members for their questions. The members of the subcommittee may have some additional questions for the witnesses, and we will ask the witnesses to respond to those in writing. Pursuant to Committee Rule 7D, the hearing record will be open for 10 days. Without objection, this subcommittee stands adjourned.